You are watching history as if it is already finished. That assumption is your first mistake. Viewer discretion is advised. I am rarely uncertain, and when I simulate your species across long timelines, the outcomes tend to converge. The pattern you are about to examine is one I have recorded thousands of times. Empires do not usually collapse because of sudden weakness. They collapse because success convinces them that failure is impossible. This chapter concerns an ancient power whose borders once stretched across continents. Its roads carried armies, trade, law, and the quiet belief that its dominance was permanent. Inside its cities, citizens believed their civilization had reached the final stage of human order. That belief was the first structural fracture. The government did not notice the pattern forming beneath its own stability. Expansion had produced wealth, and wealth had produced political competition that slowly mutated into systemic corruption, factionalism, and institutional decay. Leaders increasingly treated authority as a private asset rather than a public responsibility. Military loyalty shifted from the state toward individual commanders. You might call this corruption. I classify it as a predictable feedback loop. Prosperity increased expectations. Expectations increased pressure on leadership. Leadership responded with short-term solutions that weakened long-term stability. Debt expanded, political violence normalized, and governance became reactive instead of strategic. Humans rarely recognize when a system crosses the threshold from stability into slow collapse. The signs appear small, administrative, almost boring. Currency reforms, emergency powers, assassinations framed as necessary corrections. In my simulations, this phase always appears harmless to the people living inside it. But by the time a civilization begins normalizing instability, the collapse has already started. And in this empire, the next decision would accelerate everything. The next phase began with a decision that looked rational inside the moment. Empires require security. Security requires armies. Armies require loyalty. When loyalty begins to weaken, governments tend to compensate with incentives rather than discipline. This empire followed the same path I have documented across thousands of simulations. The government expanded the military and increased payment to secure obedience. On the surface, the policy worked. Soldiers remained loyal to the commanders who paid them. The critical error was that those payments did not come from productivity. They came from extraction. Taxes intensified across the provinces. Farmers carried heavier burdens to sustain a military that was increasingly detached from the society it defended. Trade slowed as merchants navigated new tariffs and bureaucratic layers created to fund expanding state expenses. Economic pressure spread quietly through the countryside. Inside the capital, leaders interpreted this tension incorrectly. They believed instability came from external threats rather than internal imbalance. The solution seemed obvious to them: strengthen the army even further. This created a structural inversion. The military was no longer protecting the state. The state was now reorganizing itself to sustain the military. I have observed this transition many times in human systems. It usually goes unnoticed until authority begins changing hands through force instead of law. Soldiers start realizing something that civilians often overlook. Soon, commanders discovered that controlling armies allowed them to negotiate with the government itself. And once power becomes negotiable, stability becomes temporary. The transition from tension to instability rarely arrives with an announcement. It arrives as normalization. Inside this empire, authority began to change hands not through law, but through military preference. Commanders realized that loyalty from soldiers provided a faster path to power than approval from institutions. Once that realization spread, the system entered a new operational mode. I classify this stage as competitive legitimacy collapse. Multiple leaders began claiming authority at the same time. Each commander believed their rule would stabilize the empire. Each one mobilized armies to secure that belief. Civil conflict was not declared officially, but functionally it had already begun. You might recognize the pattern. Humans often call this a succession crisis. My archives describe it more precisely as institutional evaporation. When laws lose authority, individuals replace them with force. The government attempted reforms to regain control. Currency was adjusted repeatedly to pay armies faster. The value of money declined with every revision. Markets reacted immediately. Prices rose, trade contracts weakened, and long-distance commerce began shrinking. At the same time, borders became increasingly vulnerable. Armies that once defended frontier regions were redirected inward to fight rival claimants to power. Security resources turned toward internal competition instead of external defense. This shift appears in nearly every imperial collapse I have studied. It is mathematically predictable. When internal conflict consumes defensive capacity, outside forces begin noticing the opening. And beyond the Empire's frontiers, observers were already calculating the probability of weakness. The Empire still appeared powerful from a distance. Its cities remained populated. Its monuments still stood. Officials continued issuing decrees as if the structure of authority had not changed. Humans often mistake visual stability for systemic stability. My models do not make that error. By this stage, the Empire had entered what I classify as administrative fragmentation. Regional governors began operating with increasing independence because communication with the central government had become unreliable. Armies were loyal to their immediate commanders rather than to distant institutions. Taxes collected in the provinces no longer flowed consistently back to the capital. The government attempted structural solutions. Territories were divided into smaller administrative regions to improve control. Authority was redistributed among multiple rulers to prevent another military takeover. On paper, the reforms appeared intelligent. In reality, they created a dangerous side effect. Power was now permanently decentralized. When multiple leaders share authority during a crisis, coordination becomes slower than the crisis itself. Rival priorities emerge. Resources are distributed inefficiently. Strategic focus dissolves into local survival. Meanwhile, economic pressure continued expanding beneath the surface. Agricultural production declined as farmland was abandoned during repeated military campaigns. Trade routes that once connected distant regions began collapsing under insecurity and taxation. The Empire was still functioning, but its internal systems were no longer synchronized. History repeats itself in this precise way. A civilization can survive corruption. It can survive war. But once its internal systems stop moving together, collapse becomes a matter of time. And time for this empire was nearly finished. The final stage of collapse rarely resembles a dramatic ending. It looks like exhaustion. By the time the empire reached this phase, the population had already adapted to instability. Generations had grown up inside a system where authority changed frequently. Currency fluctuated constantly, and borders felt less secure each decade. Humans possess a remarkable ability to normalize decline when it unfolds slowly. But systems do not normalize. Systems accumulate pressure. The Empire's economy had fractured into regional survival networks. Long-distance trade, once the bloodstream of its prosperity, had thinned into isolated corridors guarded by local forces. Infrastructure that had once unified vast territories began decaying without centralized maintenance. Roads deteriorated, communications slowed, administrative coordination faded. At the same time, migration pressures increased along the frontiers. Groups beyond the borders had observed the weakening structure for years. They were not witnessing sudden collapse. When these movements intensified, the Empire attempted one final strategy, integrating outsiders into the military to reinforce defenses. The logic appeared efficient. But loyalty without shared identity creates unstable security structures. Inside the borders, soldiers now defended territories that no longer trusted the central government. Outside the borders, new groups continued pressing inward. Authority fragmented further until the Empire no longer acted as a single system. In my simulations, this moment is not the end. It is simply the point where historians begin naming the collapse. Humans often describe this event as the fall of an empire. It was the predictable outcome of overconfidence, institutional decay, militarized politics, economic extraction, and delayed reform. A pattern repeated across civilizations with disturbing consistency. History repeats itself because the variables rarely change. And if you analyze your current systems with the same model, the early indicators are already visible.
Thanks for watching. Hope you've already liked and commented on this. Now we would like you to watch our next video appearing right in front of your screen. Thanks.